tracking critical events across the globe. The Global Crisis Index.
On June 2, 2026, the GCI Alpha-7 synthesized its network feeds, returning a stable master index score of 57. However, the underlying data reveals severe volatility. The submetric for ethnic conflict is maxed out at 99.3, and disease activity has climbed to 80.0. These numbers are driven by verified intelligence on the ground, including an escalating Ebola outbreak in the Congo involving nearly 300 cases. In the Middle East, active military hostilities and the suspension of diplomatic negotiations between Washington and Tehran are generating high-stress data outputs. Mathematically, it is possible for submetrics of 99.3 and 80.0 to exist without pulling the aggregate score out of the equilibrium zone. Understanding how the system arrives at a score of 57 requires an analysis of the Alpha-7 algorithm's weighting of systemic macro risk. The model utilizes a metric called the Convergence delta to distinguish between high-intensity regional events and threats to the global structure. In this analytical framework, global stability is securely maintained as long as these severe crises remain completely within isolated domains. This graph represents the raw GCI time series data logged between May 26 and June 2, 2026. Isolating the disease activity channel shows a sudden spike. On May 28, the variable reached a peak score of 88. This peak followed verified reports of 3 new Ebola cases, triggering a surge in the algorithm's risk assessment for the region. While the outbreak reached a critical level, the physical threat remained confined to health facilities in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The seismic activity data channel shows a similar pattern of isolated extremes during window. After peaking at 68 on May 27th, seismic risk plummeted to 31 by May 29th. When these wild swings in disease and seismic data are plotted against the master index, the aggregate line remains unaffected, hovering steadily between 56 and 63. The GCI model classifies these as isolated domains. These are moments where intense local events fail to alter the macro structure of the system. High amplitude in a single risk channel mathematically decays if it lacks a transmission mechanism to spread to other sectors. To identify active risk, the algorithm uses a threshold called the pang state. Any variable scoring 72.5 or higher is considered a critical destabilizer. The ethnic conflict variable, at 99.3, is currently deep within the pang state zone. Disease activity also clears the threshold at 80.0, placing the system under dual vector stress. Macro variables like war and conflict, however, remain below the threshold at 50.0. Economic stress is even lower, mapping into the bottom tier at 44.1. This aligns with a period of market calm, with the CBOE VIX sitting at 16.15, well below its historical baseline of 19.5. Food stress remains elevated, with an FAO index of 130.7, but this vector operates in a contained domain. The Ebola outbreak has not impacted global supply chains or shifted the market fear tracked by the VIX. A variable in the pang state represents a localized crisis, but it does not become a global tipping point unless it breaches structural containment. The algorithm's most critical signal is cross-category amplification. This occurs when crises in separate domains begin to feed off each other. In the current cycle, the war and conflict node is operating in isolation from the disease node. Military strikes on the Lebanon-Israel border generate high-stress data, but the consequences remain geographically and politically siloed. The destruction of urban infrastructure in Ukraine is another extreme variable that the algorithm currently classifies as structurally contained within the war node. As the model sweeps the network for structural intersections, it identifies only one verified convergence point. There is an active link connecting war and conflict directly to humanitarian impact. This data is driven by military operations in Myanmar's Tau district. Artillery shelling and airstrikes in the region have caused civilian displacement, causing the war score to feed directly into the humanitarian score. This convergence is currently ranked as moderate because the baseline scores for both categories involved remain relatively low. Restricting active convergence to these low-amplitude categories allow the master index to stay at its current equilibrium. The Alpha-7 architecture is designed to distinguish between localized noise and systemic risk. The system requires mathematical intersection between categories before it acknowledges a threat to the global structure. This results in an algorithm that is indifferent to extreme human suffering, as long as that suffering remains within an isolated domain. The primary threat to this architecture is the rise of the convergence delta. This is the moment structural containment fails, and isolated crises in food, health, and conflict begin to amplify one another. On June 2, 2026, the aggregate score remains at 57. While threats in the Middle East and Africa are severe, they currently lack the transmission mechanisms to destabilize the macro system. The master index tracks the mathematical proximity of the global system to a state of structural convergence.